shows is going to speak on the central track, women and families.
Okay, comrades, what I want to do today is to talk about something that really dominates all of our lives, and it's something that John Monaghan we can all talk about because we really all experience it. Inside the working class, everybody more or less is born, lives and dies inside the institution which is called the family. And that is something which in itself, when you think about it, is a very, very strange thing. Because the question I really want to address today is why is it that people live inside a family? Why is it that the family continues to exist? Why is it that really, as one of the main social institutions of this society, it still plays a very, very central and very, very crucial role? And the reason why I ask the question why is because the answer is not an obvious one. And the reason the answer is an obvious one is because if you look at every previous society, before capitalism had existed, then really you were talking about a family unit. There were all sorts of different families which existed, there were all sorts of methods of reproduction of the next generation of people, of caring for the existing generation of people. There were all sorts of different things that existed. They all had one thing in common. That actually work and the home was something which went together. They were families which were called productive families. Now, there's all this debate that goes on about whether, there was an extended family, which would be your granny, your aunts and uncles, all these different people live with you, or was it just like what they call a nuclear family today? Was it just mothers and fathers and children? But that actually isn't the central debate. Well, I don't think that's the central debate. It's an important debate, but it's not the most central thing. The most central thing, when you look at every previous part of society, is you're talking about a society where goods were produced, where people produced their means of subsistence, or the means that they went and sold on the marketplace inside of the home, and this crucially determined the role of the family and crucially determined the role of women within the family. When you talk about the capitalist family, you're talking about a family that lives in children. You're talking about a family where really, far from it being the sort of situation where things are produced inside of the home, then actually virtually everything that people consume, that people wear, that people eat, anything like that, the basic raw materials for that are bought outside of the home, produced outside of the home. That's a very, very important difference. That's a very, very important difference in terms of men and women's lives. It's also true that when you look at the family today, it is not true that men and women, by and large, I don't want to rattle any skeletons in any cupboards here, but it's not true by and large that men and women marry each other for what they can do. If you're an Eskimo, to put it crudely, you don't marry an Eskimo who can't do it legally. This is a simple fact of the matter. Why? Because this is an absolutely central part of your social life. Actually, people under capitalism do not marry. Women don't go around marrying men because they can build houses. The truth is, that's not why you do it. You buy a house, you rent a house, or something like that, or you're homeless, like very, very many people are today. You don't do it so that men can build, because men can build houses. You don't marry a man because he can chop down trees. You don't marry a man by and large because he can herd cattle. Again, women, although there's all sorts of people bother. I know, this is what I'm going to come on to, Julie, why people bother at all. If you look at it the other way around, although there's all sorts of mother-in-law jokes about, young women who can't cook and don't know what cuts of meat to buy from the butcher, by and large again, men don't marry women because they can cook. I mean, it's added advantage, I suppose, but it's not the crucial thing. You can go down to the supermarket and buy all sorts of frozen things and stick them in the oven, and most people will know the difference. You see the fitness adverts, that's what they depend on. The clever woman who buys the frozen food and doesn't tell her husband. All these things, actually the crucial thing about the family, the crucial thing about marriage under capitalism is not about the productive role of the man and the woman inside of the family. It is about individual romantic love. It is about the need or the desire to have children. It is about the need and desire to feel that you have to have a partner that you want to spend the rest of your life with. And again, without wanting to go into any of the great historical controversies that come up from time to time, did romantic love ever exist before capitalism? Yes, obviously it did exist, but it wasn't actually the crucial determining factor. Now these things are very, very important when we start to talk about the family, because then if you look at what the family means, it means that today, the social world is outside of the home, that everything that you do socially, your work, your social life, etc., is outside of the home, and therefore the family becomes the domain of the private. When When people talk about, the expression, the books written about it, all sorts of things, the hate in the heart of the world, what is it really about? It's that tiny domain of the private, away from the social, away from the exploitation, away from the alienation, away from all the other things that people suffer under capitalism. That's really what you're talking about when you talk about the family today. Now, how is it that we reach that sort of family? Because that is something, again, which when you talk about productive family, when you talk about the difference of the family today, it's something which wasn't just something that's always existed. There's always this view from some people that the families would remain the same. That's simply not true. As a matter of historical fact, you'd have to go very far back to see very, very different families indeed. It's not true that the family has always existed as it is. But not only that, the transition to the sort of family we're talking about today, the privatised nuclear family, was a transition which involved an absolutely massive revolution. And that really, I think, when you look at what happened, really, I think, in the crucial century, from the 1750s to the 1850s in this country, you're talking about a family, an old family system which was destroyed, and a new family system which really was created out of the ashes of the old, which was put in place. That's really what you're talking about when you talk about the roots of the modern family. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit today, because I think it's very, very important for us. Now, when we talk about the pre-industrial revolution, pre-1750s, what did the family look like? What it looked like was a family which was totally connected to the world. If you worked on the land, which is what most people did in those days, the vast majority of people worked on the land, then the family would have all sorts of productive functions within it. For example, in the 18th century, the figures reveal that every single farmhouse and most of the cottages in 18th century England contained a spinning wheel or a distaff as a means, as a part of the furniture, as a something that was there. Most people didn't have living rooms. You can imagine it in your living room with that spinning wheel there. That's a bit what it looks like. What does that mean? Very, very crucial. Not that they didn't have any other furniture they could put there, like 3-piece suites, but they didn't do much of that either. What the spinning wheel in the home meant was a women's fan in the home. That's what it meant. It meant that cloth was produced inside the home, and therefore was a very, very important part of family life. Now, just compare that simple fact with the fact that today it is not the case that you go into an ordinary council house and you don't find a machine in the living room. You don't find a machine for factory in the living room. You don't even find a typewriter in most places. Most women who are typists probably don't even own their own typewriter in the home. And this gives you some idea that really that was a very, very productive family indeed. It was a family which really was based on production in the home. And that was, of course, the home life and the divorce and work. All the things that means were very, very important. The attitude to children was a completely different attitude. Really you can trace the development of childhood, the love of children, all the real elevation, I think, of some parents and some children, actually the most central thing, the most dominant thing in their life, actually wasn't true in the 18th century and earlier, to anything like the same extent. Because as soon as children were able to work, they too worked around the home. And things were very, very closely and very, very integrally linked. That was the truth of the family in the 18th century. Now the problem was that when you talk about that family, you're also talking about a family which existed against a background, a world that was being lost, a world that was dying completely, a world which no longer existed by really, was rapidly ceasing to exist by the turn of the 19th century. What are you talking about? You're talking about over a period of centuries, but particularly in the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, you're talking about the drawing away of workers from the agricultural work into the factory system, into the city, into a system whereby they all became free wage labourers exploited at the point of production, and then workers then exploited at the point of production. This is a fantastic transformation in people's lives. And I don't have time to go into the details of all that transformation. But what it entailed was a whole number of things which actually smashed up the family. You can look at all the different things that happened. You talk about the enclosure of the common land, which meant that for many, many thousands of people, they no longer had the means of livelihood and the means of subsistence. They had nowhere to graze any of their animals. They had nowhere to gather fuel. And it's an interesting fact that in the south of England, unlike the north, which had different geography, in the south of England at the end of the 18th century, you talk about cooking among poor people, In the end of the 18th century, in the south of England, for agricultural labourers, that was what the farmer lunched on for something like 20 years. There was virtually no cooking that took place. Why? There was no access to the commons, there was no access to wood, to cook, to make fuel, to cook with. All these things were absolutely destroyed as a matter of course. Not only that, the end of all sorts of other functions of the family happened as well. The fact that you had vacancy on an absolutely massive scale, the vacancy was higher among women, quite interesting fact, was higher among women than it was among men, meant again that you had the complete breakdown of the family. The fact that you had the workhouse, the poor law system, the workhouse, something hated, and the people who read, you don't just have to read the history books, but if you read any of the stories of the early working class, how much they hated the workhouse, how much people detested the threat to the old people, to the sick people, to the orphan children of having to go into the workhouse. The workhouse was something which really was there in order to compensate for that massive social upheaval, for the breakdown of the family, for all those other things. Now therefore you're talking about a situation where by this time, work had been taken from the family, work was outside of the family, people were being pulled away from the family, away from the land, away from the traditional occupations that they followed in the home, into the cities, into the factories, into a completely new method of working. What does that mean? It means when the work is taken from the home is no longer the centre of life. That's really what happens when you talk about the smashing of the old family. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to the people? Because obviously it's the same people, isn't it? I mean, you always talk about, sometimes we talk about revolutions in abstract sense. You go from one mode of production to another mode of production in a completely abstract sense. Obviously, the transition is made by real people at real times, suffering very, very badly, real things for many, many years. What did it mean for the old families that were smashed up and were driven into the cities? What it meant for them was a complete transformation of their lives, and a completely miserable transformation of their lives. And I'll come on to a bit later about why, for Marxists, the working class is absolutely central in terms of the people who have how to change the world. But if you look at the transformation of their lives, it was absolutely bloody miserable. And again, I'm sure lots of people have read much of the literature about the early working class in the industrial city. Frederick Engels wrote a wonderful book, Conditions of the Working Class in England, which describes in the most graphic and horrible detail the sorts of conditions under which people lived. People were thrown, and Marx writes about it as well. He said, what does the mighty machine do? He said that really it throws the whole of the family onto the labour market. And it throws them onto the labour market, he says, regardless of age, regardless of sex, regardless of anything else, the whole bloody lot of them. And that was the early industrial, that was early capitalism. The whole of the family went from the home to being employed as wage labourers, which is why, when you look at the very, very early years of capitalism, particularly the cotton industry in Lancashire, you were talking about children at a very, very young age working, you were talking about women working full-time on the same basis as men, you were talking about men working. And sometimes it was women and children who got the jobs first. In fact, quite often in the early years of the industrial revolution, it was the women who got the weaving jobs in the mills and the factories, whereas the men who were the old weavers in the home, they could perform that function in the home, found themselves unemployed. Nonetheless, the process of industrialisation, the growth of the factory system, pulled this whole family into the factory system itself, which is why, for quite a long period of time, in the early years of capitalism, it was also true that the family as a whole was paid a wage. It wasn't true that they all got, the man got so much, the woman got so much, the children got so much. Often, the wage was allocated to the family itself, to the total family to be shared out among the family. That was the very, very early industrial family. Now, when you're talking about that family being thrown onto the labour market, what you're talking about is two real features of that, I think, which really show you the way in which the family itself already broken down, the old rural family, but also how the industrial working class family was also in the process of breaking down, wasn't able to maintain itself as well. One is that many of the functions of the family disappeared. For example, a woman called Margaret Hewitt, who wrote a book 30 years ago about the cotton industry in Lancashire, wrote that practices like eating shop-made pies and puddings and having the daycare of infants, the washing and basic cleaning, were done by women who specialised in these jobs, and these were very common among the working class. In other words, already, you're talking about the 1830s and 1840s, already you had all all the old functions of the family you'd expect the mother to do, all the old things were being done by other people, mainly by older women who could no longer work in the cotton mills, who would have been destitute, otherwise women who were pudding makers. They were women who were child carers. They were women who looked after, even cleaned, did the housework, cleaned the houses. All those sorts of jobs were done by a small army of women who congregated around the early cotton textile mills. Now that was one thing that happened. The second thing that happened was that the Industrial Revolution itself, the methods of exploitation of the Industrial Revolution, took the most terrible toll. The number of people who died as a result directly of industrialisation was absolutely staggeringly high. Marx gives a figure that 1 in 4 children in Manchester in the 1840s died before the age of 1 year. 1 in 4, you have 4 children, one of them's going to die, that's it. Absolutely phenomenal figure. You look at the figures of the children who suffered terrible mailing, the children worked for 12, 14 hours a day inside the mill, who suffered terrible maiming because at the age of 5 or 6, they would fall asleep while they were operating machinery, their hands would be cut off, or their feet would be cut off, or all sorts of other terrible things. They'd fall into machines and die. All sorts of absolutely terrible things would happen to them. It wasn't just true of the children. It was true particularly if you looked at mothers, nursing mothers, pregnant mothers, all those people as well. Women who had to work, who couldn't stop work, who would give birth sometimes virtually in the factory, who would try and go back to work immediately after they had the children, in most grotesquely horrible conditions. When they make factories today, it's absolutely palatable. You all know the problems with factories today, the absolutely grotesquely dirty and horrible conditions. These were the conditions in which women and children and men had to live and had to work in order to simply get their social. The conditions were indescribably bad. Now, again, there's all sorts of arguments. Was this an improvement? Was it better than the old rural way of life, or was it worse? Some people look back to the old rural way of life as better. Somehow think, no, actually, in the old rural way of life, just because you were in the home didn't mean you didn't get injured by machinery, didn't mean you didn't work fantastically long hours, didn't mean any of those things, but the pressure of the factory system, the fact that women actually were working outside of the home, and this seems to have a direct correlation with the rise in infant mortality rates. Actually, the areas where women did work outside of the home, actually, even in agriculture that was done on an industrial basis, as it was in East Anglia at that time, the infant mortality shot up. Those were the things. Now, what did this really mean? It meant that by the 1840s, you had a situation where the working class family was in danger of dying out. Not in the sense that they were, the people who died every minute, but in the sense, actually, the reproduction of the next generation of workers was at risk. The chances of a child who started work at the age of 5 being a decent, healthy, able-bodied worker by the age of 18 was fairly slim. That was the truth of the matter. The pregnant women suffered terrible privations as a result of it, and therefore there was a real possibility of the working class families dying out. Now, it was in these years, in the 1830s, the 1840s, and the 1850s, that you also saw the development of certain things, certain very, very important features in terms of the future development of the working class, which are today questions of great controversy. And in particular, the people who believe in the theory of patriarchy, who believe that there's something eternal about women's oppression, really placing the time, the 1830s and 1840s in particular, as the time really when male workers went into an alliance with patriarchy, went into an alliance with the capitalist class, as they sometimes put it, in order to drive women out of work and in order to exclude women from the home. How, the argument goes, did they do this? Now, the argument is put something like this. It says, firstly, men fought for their privilege in the form of a family wage. They wanted to get a family wage, which then women and children would have to be dependent on. That was the first argument that went. The second argument that went was that there were all sorts of protective legislation introduced in the 1830s and 1840s, which actually, again, were a collusion between male workers and between the capitalist class in order to exclude women from various jobs. That was the second thing that they argued. Now, actually, when you look at what really happened, then you're talking about a very situation indeed. Because actually it was true that the family wage is something which became much more of a demand for working class people around the middle of the 19th century. It was also true that protective legislation legislation was introduced in the 1830s to restrict the hours of children, in the 1840s to restrict the hours of women and children, and also to exclude women and children from coal mining, which is where they could work. These were both matters of historical fact. There's absolutely no controversy about the fact that those laws were actually introduced. Except you have to say to yourself, what was the reason why they were introduced? And I think we have to look in all sorts of ways at the different pressures which were coming to bear on the working class and on the capitalist class at that time. You see, I think firstly the question of protective legislation. You see, that protective legislation by the 1842 Act prevented women and children from working in the mines. That actually was, for women and children, it meant that some women and children were denied jobs. Actually, the figures weren't always that big. I mean, for example, in Yorkshire, out of every 1,000 men working in the coal mines, there were only 22 women. In the east of Scotland it was higher, but even then it was only 300 odd women as opposed to 1,000 for every 1,000 men. Therefore you're talking about, anyway, women, not as the major people who work in the coal mines, not as the majority of people. Also, there were people who worked there for a very short amount of time. You know, they've worked there since really the development of capitalism and stuff. They hadn't been there since the mining industry. There've been people who've been better, actually since transporting, since more advanced transporting had been going on. And that meant that really when you talked about the protective legislation, you were talking about a situation where for women, it was possible to say that really firstly, they were the people who were doing most of the jobs. Secondly, when you looked at actually the benefits from the leaving the mines, it wasn't true that working class men did. It wasn't true. I'll tell you why, for a very, very simple reason, because men actually lost the wages of women and children. And the idea that the family wage compensated for it just simply was not true. That the family wage was something which is only in reality a wage for the whole of the Victorian period. It was never a reality for more than a month, 20% of the working class. I think it was much nearer 10% of the working class. In other words, real skilled workers. It wasn't true for most of the rest of them. It was the case that really when you looked at it, you were talking about a situation where actually the only people it really benefited were the capitalists. Why did it benefit the capitalist class with protective legislation? Very, very quickly, two things. The first was that really, for them, they were able to benefit in terms of the next generation and the future generations of workers. The fact that they were able to re-establish a working class family, the fact that they were able to do that, the fact that they were able to re-establish women as people who had to care for children, care for them much better, and alongside all sorts of other things, you know, the rise in the education system, better health, all sorts of things that went along with the second half of the 19th century. You were talking about a situation where the unpaid work of the woman in the home actually benefited the capitalist class because it meant the reproduction of the next generation of labour power. When you look at it as well, it's also the case that for the ruling class, they were able to impose something that was becoming increasingly important for them, and that was their own standards and norms of discipline on the working class. Most of the historical writings that you read on the thing suggest that really one of the ways in which they try to impose discipline was by using the argument, the moralistic argument, that encourages sexuality down below ground, you know, men and women working together, we want to get them out of it, we want to get them out of the pit. That was the argument that was put. Actually, it was used as a means of straitjacketing within the working class. It was used as one of the ways, along with all sorts of other things like increasing emphasis on time, all those sorts of things, it was used as a means of straitjacketing. Nonetheless, when you look at it, there's also one third thing I just want to quickly throw in there, which is that even though many married women suffer, particularly married women suffer from protective legislation, actually it was also the case that throughout the whole of the 19th century, the number of married women working went up, right up until the end of the 19th century. So it wasn't true, but you know, what happened was men went in, got the protective legislation, had to deal with the capitalist class, 30 pieces of silver, and suddenly, you know, bang, all the women were out the back in the home again. That wasn't what happened actually throughout the whole of the 19th century, because capitalism was an expanding system actually, that's the basic reason why. Because it was expanding, you found that women were pulled back into were still pulled back into the labour market at increasing pace. However, that protective legislation and the family wage were a step backward for women. Why were they? Really because it increased the ideology of women in the home. Because also it maintained a division of labour inside the working class. It meant that, for example, in mining, you had a situation where the working class is virtually totally male, as it still is today. And thirdly, because it maintained the separation of home and work. Now actually, if you look at the situation of the family today, I don't want to spend very much time, I haven't got very much time to speak on the family today, but when you look at the family situation of the family today, you actually see women's oppression is rooted in the contradiction between the fact that work remains social, housework, work inside the home, reproduction of the next generation of labour power remains privatised, remains something that women alone are supposed to do. Now that has been broken down partially by the massive influx of women into the workforce over the last 50 years. The fact that the majority of married women now work for most of their lives as single women has broken that down partially, but only partially for that. You look at women's oppression, you look at the sorts of jobs that women do, women's oppression structures the sorts of jobs that they do. The fact they do part-time jobs, the fact they do low-paid jobs, the fact that no one expects them to have the right to get equal pay, all of these things are things that you're talking about really breaking down, and partially broken down, but nonetheless, it's still structured by women's work is still structured by the oppression of women, it's still structured very, very much by the family form, which maintains the oppression of women, very, very important altogether. Now, why then does the family, if I go back to the original question, why does the family continue to exist? Why then does it continue to keep going? Now I think we have to look at a number of questions. I think there is economic role. You know, the fact that the family actually it's a cheap and convenient way. There's arguments about whether it's the cheapest way to reproduce the next generation. But the fact that women in the home with, say, 2 children will spend hours and hours of every day of their lives caring for children in a fantastic detail, often a one-to-one relationship, which is a better relationship than you get at a place or in a nursery, a state nursery, where it's probably 1 to 5. Even there, you know, it's a fantastically demanding job looking after small children. Women do that for nothing. Very, very important in terms of the capitalist time. I think the ideological function of the family, particularly in terms of people seeing it as something that they aspire to, seeing it as something which is relief from the world of work, seeing it as something which is relief from alienation, is fantastically important as well. But crucially, when you look at what the crucial role of the family is, then actually you're talking about capital, it being the reproduction of labour power itself. The fact that actually for the capitalist class, it does get that next generation reproduced, is absolutely crucial to its own existence and to the existence of a class which it can then exploit. And that is why, and when you look at who benefits from the oppression of women in the home, it is clearly rooted not in the individual needs of men, it's clearly rooted in the needs of the capitalist class itself. The problem is, when you look at the family, when you look at all the problems that people have living in families, that actually the family can't live up to its expectations. You know, we're told it's the most wonderful thing. You know, if you're a girl, we're told it's the most wonderful thing to do is to get married. We're told if you're not married by the time you're 25, you must be on the shelf. We're told all these sorts of things. We're told, isn't it wonderful? And then, you know, comes 30, 35, that's when the valium starts going. That's when all the young mothers with the children stuck at home are on the valium. They're stuck on the valium months and months, years and years, thoroughly miserable, thoroughly alienated by being stuck in between 4 walls. Nobody to talk to apart from a 2-year-old. Whatever the delights of 2-year-olds, they're not the greatest intellectual conversers, to the best of my knowledge. You know, all those things, the family cannot live up to its expectations. And actually, everything about capitalism itself also works to break down the family. The fact that only a third of families at any time are conventional mother, father, heterosexuals, 2.4 children, 1.8 children as it is now, whatever the figure. There's only a third of families are like that. And lots of the others are pensioners, or people who live on their own, God knows what, either single parent, God knows what else. People who may have been in conventional families at one time, and yet it gives you an idea. The ideal, you know, this ideal of this wonderful family, the thing they tell you is so powerful, and actually 2/3 of families at any one time are not even, in any sense, part of that family. You look at the fact that single parents today are now 1 in 4. You look at the fact that divorce today is 13 per 1,000. You look at the fact that daycare, you know, we're told that women are the only people who, the mother is the only person who can look after the child, yet the figures for daycare, the places for daycare, have gone up 10 times to 600,000 places since 1961, when there were 60,000 places. Absolutely phenomenal expansion in daycare. Why? Capitalism leaves women's labour outside of the home as well as in the home. The fact that the first marriages, although marriage is still going, lots and lots of people are divorced, obviously don't know that less than one time around and go and do it again. This is a very, very common feature of life. Actually, the number of first marriages, though, is down to an all-time low. It's very, very low, as people don't really see need to get married, and of course the fact that the family is the most vulnerable institution you can care to name. There's a very interesting statistic. I don't think people have ever been to the American city of Detroit, which is always heralded, even by American Revolution, the British Revolution, because God, you've got to go to Detroit, it's so awful. You can't walk down the street, it's absolutely terrible, you go in and off licenses, they point the gun at you and you get $2 down for a bottle of beer or whatever. All those sorts of, real horror, actually it's very black word in our city, Detroit, it's obviously one of the things about it. But anyway, all these stories about Detroit, figures for Detroit in 1973, out of every 4 out of every 5 homicides was committed by a friend or a neighbour or a relative of the victim. Now you bloody well think about it, and to be honest, if that's what you're talking about, it's nothing to do with Detroit, it's nothing to do with the city itself, it's got everything to do with the family institution and the way in which the family has to bear the brunt of what is real poverty, real exploitation, all the other things that people suffer in the capitalist process today. And therefore, the whole ideal of the happy family. I mean, there's a very interesting article in the New Society the other week actually saying the idea of the happy family is all very well, but you need a hell of a lot of money to maintain the happy family. That's the other aspect of it. You try it on Social Security, you try it as a single parent, you try it if really you can't afford to buy your kids all the presents they want at Christmas. If you can't afford a car so that the wife can go to the supermarket and load up all the nice food you can afford at Sainsbury's or Waitrose or the others into the back of the car and drive it back again, you look at it if you're one of the 17,000 people last year who were repossessed on their mortgages because they believe Margaret Thatcher's dream that everyone can be a homeowner, and then 17,000 last year got thrown out of their homes because they couldn't repay the mortgages. You need bloody high income, which is one reason that women are a permanent part of the workforce today in the way that they work. What you're talking about, the reason, when you talk about the family as a single trap, you're talking about people's only hope in society, but also a system which increasingly is unable, is incapable of living up to the promises that it makes. Increasingly incapable of living up to the promises that it makes. And that's why, you talk about it. The final thing I just want to say very, very quickly is when you talk about what happens when the family starts to break down, very, very interesting thing. The state intervenes in order to prop it up. Now, there is now a thing, a body called family law, which is absolutely massive. Used to be a law student, absolutely massive tomes of family law, which is all about divorce, custody, Christ knows what else, maintenance of women and children, all sorts of absolutely boring stuff. Why does it exist? It exists because the state has to go in to mediate between the individual members of the family. Why is it you can be put in prison for battering your children? No doubt that people here, we're not saying we're in favour of people battering children. Why can people be put in prison for battering their children, put in prison for not sending their children to school? Because the state intervenes at every stage to make sure that really the family is functioning more or less all right. Forget all the 4 out of 5 homicides in Detroit. Forget the fact that over Christmas and New Year is a period of the highest murders take place in this country. Murders and batterings shoot up Christmas and New Year. Why everybody's bad in the family? They can't stand each other in 5 days. That's the truth there. You look at all that. Forget all that. They have to try and patch the system up, and that's really what it's all about. Now, this is something that sends right-wingers, all these right-wing ideologists who write about the family. This sends them completely bonkers. Paul Johnson, Matthew Ferdinand Mouse, who's actually quite intelligent, one of Thatcher's advisors, who wrote a book called The Subversive Family, they hate this state intervention in the family. They say, why the hell can't people live as they want in their own little families? I mean, Ferdinand Mouse even described, I think he just told me, it's so funny, he hates state interference so much. He talks about health visitors. Women who go and visit babies, mothers and babies after they've been born. Most mothers and babies are too glad to see something like that. Ferdinand Mouse says, this tiny middle-aged body has at her ultimate disposal a Stalinist array of powers. Because she's able to go in, make sure the baby's being fed, make sure the nappies are being put on the right way, all the other fairly mundane things this poor old health visitor has to do. Now, according to Ferdinand Mouse, this is a Stalinist array of powers. What a great, right, and hate the idea that there's any state intervention in anything. And yet, you look at what happens, despite everything that Margaret Thatcher's tried to do, despite everything she's tried to say, they have to intervene. Even the Tories have to intervene. Even the Tories can do very, very little to stop it. Why? Because the family itself is the product of the party, just as you can have to say, and therefore is absolutely essential for the state to intervene, and increasingly has to intervene, and therefore you get this absolutely crazy situation. On the one hand, the system breaks it down in all sorts of ways. South Africa, the Labour system breaks down the family. Immigration, the fact that Bengalis have to come and live in this country. I'm not sure most women like if they chose to, this miserable, wet, cold, horrible country. Have to come and live here and breaks down the family. Nonetheless, all the time, constant pressures in order to try and patch it up again. It really is a botched up job. That is the truth of it. When you look at every statistic about the family today, you're talking about a completely botched up job that isn't really, it's very, very shaky, not going to last that much longer, I suppose, and also is fantastically difficult and fantastically horrible for the many, many millions of individuals who have to live in some of the more distorted and more botched up families that do exist. Now, just finally, is there a way of reforming the family? See, some people say that there is. I mean, these idiotic women, Michelle Barrett and Mary McIntosh, who wrote this book, The Antisocial Family, which isn't very good, actually. But it's very good if you want to quote, really, because I can't quote, but never mind, but I'll try to remember it. But it's very, very good in terms of what they say. These are middle-class lecturers, nothing against, I'm sure we've got some people who are middle-class lecturers, nothing against them. Isn't an attack, these are middle-class lecturers. Isn't the family awful? What should people do? Don't go to weddings, that's the first thing. Don't support marriage. Any woman who is coquettish to a man, or any mother who spoils a child, is making it harder for the rest of us to resist the family. It goes on in this sort of vein. Of course, the final thing, guess what? There is nothing wrong really with paying another woman to do your housework. But it should be just like engaging a plumber. It should be just like engaging, I mean, most of us don't engage a plumber. That's expensive enough, but the idea you can afford, let alone if you want to, if you're a socialist, that you can actually, you can afford to employ a woman to do your house, but you just think about what it means. What it means is reform of the family means one thing, actually. It means for a few women, very nice standing. Yes, you can reform it all the way to the bank, lots of housing, lots of cars, lots of servants, very, very good. For the mass of the working class, you're talking about a situation where it's absolutely dire. Where it's absolutely dire, of course, guess who? It's not the working class men that are employed, that they employ to clean their houses and look after them just like a plumber. No, it's the working class women who fit it in with their childcare and all the other things that they do. And therefore, for me, it's a question of there is no reform of the family. Now then, just 1 minute, really, that what you're talking about then is that, what does that mean? What does it mean actually in a capitalist system, you have to defend the family? You said there's no reform, it's actually have to defend it. If I was in South Africa now, or even I'm talking about South Africa now, I would take it for granted you defend the right of the working class to have family, because they don't have at the moment. They live in barracks hundreds of miles apart from each other. I take it for granted that in the United States of America, when slavery destroyed the black family for many, many people, I take it for granted that any socialist would defend the right of the slave family to exist. The children shouldn't have been able to be sold off. But the way in which the woman was treated as a sex object by the slave owner, the children were sold off, the family was split up, absolutely central for black people in terms of raising their own demands, in terms of raising their own sense of pride and dignity, was to support the right of that family to exist. Absolutely correct. But it's also true that we fight to destroy the family, the society that produces it. That we don't believe that really the family is the institution of capitalism, and therefore such you do have to defend it against the ravages, against the attacks from various aspects of the capitalist system. I also believe at the end of the day it produces relationships which is stultified, relationships which are very, very difficult. It doesn't allow the free sexual and social development of any single member, individual within it, and therefore in that sense we're in favour of fighting to destroy not the family. People can choose in such a society how they live, and most people want children to live in the heterosexual 2.4 tax. I think that's fairly obvious. I think our vision would be slightly more wide by then. But if they want to do like that would be absolutely their choice. We fight to destroy the society that produces the family. That is in the interest, not just of women who suffer oppression within the family, not just of children who are people, again, whose hopes and aspirations are often destroyed, often by the love that they get within the family. Actually, it's also in the interest of the whole of the working class, it's in the interest of the whole of men workers, of women workers, the whole of the working class, to destroy the society which makes the family such an oppressive institution. inside the home, who is to blame for the violence that she's seen? And you see, on one level, individual men and women hit individual children. Because occasionally children can hit them, but you know, that's something that's quite common when they get older. Basically, this leads really to the idea that somehow, you know, what the family is, it's the real last bastion of male power. You know, it's kicked around at work, you know, a terrible time, he's exploited, nothing goes right for him, it's really dreadful, you know, he's having it terrible. So he comes home, what does he do? You know, slams the door, kicks the cat, beats the wife around, they give him the tea ready, thumps the children, etc. You know, the scenario, you know, the Andy-Cat view, I suppose, of the working class family. Now actually, anybody who lives in the working class family, or anybody who knows anything about it, or even people who go and done or study in libraries and don't, know that actually most families, it's not the real relationship is one of completely dominant power of the man over the rest of the family. It just simply isn't true. To be honest, even about social feminists, if we read people like Sheila Robotham, we'll talk a lot about how women have actually created space for themselves and so on in the family. But actually how women actually unlock powers within the family, how they have very, very specifically defined roles. Now often those roles are more powerful. Because the idea is this patriarchal power. I mean, the tradition, for example, in many working class households, for the man to hand over the wage to the woman when he walked in the door, was very, very common. I mean, it still exists in some places, but it was very, very common up to probably 20 or 30 years ago. The fact that in the minds, when the family wage was a family wage paid to all the families that they were in the 1830s and 1840s, it wasn't a patriarchal privilege, it was a privilege of the family. And therefore, even when the woman, even when the man, the father of the family died, you know, the man in the family died, the widow still used to be paid the wages, even though she didn't work in the mine. She used to be paid, or she only did the secondary work in the mine. She was still paid the wages of the children in order to maintain the family. The idea really is just this complete bastion of power which resides in that just simply isn't true, and it cannot explain so many things. It cannot explain the contradictory relationships that people have. It cannot explain that actually one of the worst aspects of the family is that people sometimes impressive things about it is the way that people love each other.
We'll come in here now and fight for ourselves and make a better life for ourselves. But this creates all sorts of problems, because within my college, that stance means they can't function within the union, because they come to union meetings with all these ideas. And what do they see? They see a black Tory getting up all the time and saying, well, on anti-apartheid motions, he'll get up and say, well, I oppose this motion because it's going to, it's going to affect my shares in Barclays. And it carries on like things like that. They can't argue with that because it totally annihilates their arguments. So they can't even, in the here and now, fight for themselves, because they come up against this position all the time. And generally the idea that racism is a white problem is, I mean, I think that idea is going to end up with the conclusions that Herzl found with anti-Semitism. It is medical and homeland is the only answer. And this creates for black nationalists an idea of pessimism and futility. And unless they can overcome that and see it is a class problem, I feel very sorry for them.
Anyone else want to come in? I'm sure it's a bit more controversial. Come here, Jeff.
I agree with your job reservations legislated. I think you're open to accusations from black nationalists that in this country institutionalised racism can act in the same way as legislated colour bar in South Africa. So I'm not sure, but I think we maybe need to develop that a bit more about exactly why whites in South Africa do benefit from black oppression.
So I think the argument about straightforward economic argument about whites not benefited from lack of pressure as far as wage rate is concerned was all very well. I think we have to take it a step further. I was at a Black Sections meeting before Christmas with Diane Abbott, and everybody knows how dishonest black nationalists are anyway, so if you beat them on a straightforward argument like that, which you can't always, but often it makes quite a lot of sense, and they will immediately turn around and not be faced up to that argument and start coming out with a lot of other stuff. The other stuff they come out with, I think, our experience was, well, racism just isn't about economics, it's also about the day-to-day experience of blacks inside Britain. And I've got a lot of rubbish then about, whites have got innate theory or superiority, therefore they're more confident to operate and so on. But that side is the more stupid side of it, I think. The other argument they come up with is, of course, the day-to-day feeling experience of racism, like going to hospitals, going to doctors, buses, wherever you want to name the particular areas of the experience. And that is not linked to the former argument about economics and wage rates and so on. This is a whole different kettle of fish, and this is why whites benefit. But I think we've really got to extend the argument to cover that and say that if blacks experience racism in all sorts of other ways, not just in terms of wage rates and so on, it's because whites don't benefit from black pressure in terms of wage rates, that in fact prevents the conditions for racism being overcome, because the conditions blacks face every day on the streets are a direct product of, as the speaker was saying earlier here, of actually the working class being split up. There's a relation between the conditions blacks face in hospitals in terms of racism or in institutions variously, and directly between that and wage rates and the ability of the class overall to fight back. See, I think it's a correct argument, but I think we've got to be sophisticated about it and actually show that it's not just a simple economic